Welcome to the Copeland Coaching Podcast, where it's all about turning your job search into a slam dunk. Your host is Angela Copeland.
Welcome to the Copeland Coaching Podcast. I'm your host, Angela Copeland. Live on the phone with me today, I have Mark Sanborn in Denver, Colorado. Mark is an international inspirational keynote speaker and author of 7 best-selling books that have topped the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and USA Today. Mark is also the author of his new book, The Potential Principle, a proven system for closing the gap between how good you are and how good you could be. Mark, thanks for joining me today.
Well, thank you, Angela. Looking forward to it.
Yes, I mentioned before we got started, I'm so excited. I think you're going to have a lot of really great advice for our listeners. And I know one thing that you really talk about a lot is how to escalate our performance in the workplace. And I'm curious, just to really kind of get started, what's a tip that you have for how we can escalate our own performance in the workplace?
Well, that's an easy one, and I write about it in my book, and that is quit multitasking. Multitasking has been shown to be a myth. It's actually task switching, and when you multitask, you lose IQ points. It's a little like driving under the influence. You switch back and forth, and you don't give any task that you're working on the kind of attention that it really deserves. And it keeps us from doing really good work. It keeps us from doing creative work. It keeps us from solving problems because we just kind of skitter along on the surface. Now, people will say, well, multitasking is imposed upon me because every time I try to do something, somebody calls me or pops by my office. And one of the things that I suggest is that if you've got an important project you're working on, give it an appointment on your calendar just like you would an important person. Really, projects are sometimes as or more important than the people who drop by. Their needs, unless they're truly important and time sensitive, shouldn't trump the important work that you need to be doing. So that would be my first big tip, is to stop multitasking, acknowledge you're really not multitasking, you're just task switching, and it isn't serving you well.
Gosh, I love that, and I totally agree. It's interesting. I think I've seen numbers that say when hiring managers identify their top, let's say, 5 skill sets that they're looking for in a new hire, multitasking is usually in that top 5 list. Do you have recommendations on, if we're trying to focus in more, maybe we're adding things to our calendar, but our boss has feedback that we need to be multitasking more? How can we sell this to them that it's not the best idea?
Well, I think that they probably either don't understand what multitasking is, or they're using it as a less accurate term. Mm-hmm. I think, the ability to have diverse skills and to be able to be agile. Agility is definitely a skill, to be able to respond quickly or to switch course if necessary. But I think it would be probably, if you can, a good idea to talk about what multitasking really is and why it's not a good thing, and find out by asking the simple question, when you say multitasking, what exactly does that mean? Because the latest research I've read says that multitasking is really not what it's cut out to be. The next thing that I would say about that is that, you might be at least a little reticent to work in an environment where multitasking is considered a good thing. Again, I think that in large part is probably a lack of clarification about what multitasking is and what the hiring manager really means. But just beware of an environment that is so fast-paced that nobody focuses for very long on anything.
God, I totally agree. I totally agree. Well, so another thing that you talk about, and that I talk to people a lot, they're feeling overlooked at work. And it's really tough when we feel like we're not being selected for internal promotions, for example. And I was wondering, do you have suggestions for us if we're having this experience, if we're being overlooked for internal promotions, what's something that we can do to be identified sort of more as a top performer?
There's a couple ideas, and the first is to volunteer rather than waiting to be asked. If you're in a meeting and a project comes up and, the person running the meeting starts that process of deliberation, okay, who should I pick? Just be assertive and say, you know what, I'd be glad to lead that, or I'd like to be on the committee, or I would like to be on the team. The other thing, and it's a variation of volunteering, is if you can see opportunities to add value to your work or to your department, I would take advantage of that because I've yet to meet a manager. I've met a few managers who might try to take credit for the value you add, but I've really yet to meet any manager that says, no, whatever you do, don't create value for our customers, don't add value to our department. So I'd always be looking for ways to do your job in a way that has never been done before. And occasionally, and certainly performance reviews are a good time to do it, even though regrettably, a lot of managers don't ask. That doesn't mean you can't offer a summary of the things you've done to add value to your work or to your department or your organization when you do sit down for your annual or whatever time frame your performance review takes place.
Oh, I totally agree. I feel like very often the performance review is kind of minimized in terms of importance. And we often look at it almost like it's just something on a checklist that we're checking off to move on to the next thing. But it's really something I think that influences your future career progression at times.
Well, performance reviews aren't usually done well. They're usually retroactive. It's usually like telling you all the things you were doing wrong, but it's too late to change them. You can take a little bit of control in a performance review by at the end, and this goes back to your original question, saying to your boss, what things do I need to be doing in the months ahead to qualify myself for a promotion? In other words, let them give you the answers to the test. Don't try to second guess them. Get the answers, and that doesn't guarantee they'll give you a promotion, but it gives you a lot of fodder when you do go in and you say, you know what, you recommended I do these 4 things. Here's what I've been doing, and it makes it very difficult then to say, well, yeah, that really wasn't enough, because you're asking them to tell you in the months ahead what you need to be doing to qualify for a promotion.
Absolutely, and you're being proactive as opposed to kind of waiting for them to bring it to you.
Yeah, otherwise you're just going to be at the mercy of your manager or your boss.
Absolutely. Well, we were talking a little bit about your book, The Potential Principle, and you mentioned in the book that we need to focus on how good we could be instead of how good we've become. And help me to understand, why is that where we should be focusing on?
Well, I've never met anybody that could prove to me they were functioning or performing at their absolute peak potential. We just don't know. I mean, really, our potential is unknown. However, I know that all of us have the ability, if we choose, to be more and do more than we've done in the past. Now, it's America. You can choose to be mediocre, stay the same. But to put it a little differently, if I said to you, today is the best day your life will ever have, from here on out it's going to be all downhill, I don't think you would meet that with gladness. I don't think you'd say, well, that's great news. You'd think that's terrible. This, if I live another 20, 30 years, it's all going to be less than what my life has been to date. So when you think about it that way, we don't want our lives to go downhill, but how many people consciously do things every day to make sure that doesn't happen? When we did research on the book, we found that about 57% of the people we interviewed said they were committed to getting better, but only 30% had a specific plan. Ooh. So there's a big disconnect between intention and reality, or between planning and performing. And that's really why I wrote the book, so people would have a way to not just plan, but some tools to use to make sure that path towards getting better was intentional, and frankly, it's never accidental. Nobody gets better accidentally. Wine gets better with age without trying, but the rest of us, we have to work at it.
That's true. Well, I'm curious, why do you think there is such a big gap there between sort of the intention and the planning?
Well, probably the same reason there's a big gap between our New Year's resolutions and our second week of January's behavior. That old poem we all heard as kids about, or that colloquialism, the road to hell is paved with good intentions, right? It takes discipline. Discipline is probably fallen out of favor in our culture today. Discipline is the ability to do what needs to be done, even when you don't feel like it. It's the secret to working out. It's the secret to losing weight. It's the secret to being good at work. It's the secret to a better relationship. We live in an age where there's so much good information. All we have to do is turn on our computer and be a little bit careful and make sure that the information we're accessing is valid. But it always falls upon us to apply the ideas, and it takes work. And I think that's the gap right there. We kind of feel better when we intend to do something and don't do it than if we don't even intend to. I think we kind of pacify ourselves by saying, well, I'm going to do that someday, or I'd like to do that, or I plan to do that, but we don't get around to it.
Oh, I totally agree. And I love that you focused on discipline. I think we've really lost sight of that sometimes. We so much want to enjoy each moment that we don't want to focus on things that are difficult or that we don't want to do because we can't seem to see that long-term goal.
Well, passion is good, but discipline's better, because there's a lot of days I'm not full of passion, but
Yeah.
every day gives me an opportunity to move closer towards my goals. Writing books is the same way.
Right.
People say, how do you write a book? And the answer is you sit down and you put enough words on paper and you organize until you have a book. And that's truly simple, but that's everybody I know that's intended to write a book but hasn't written a book has never gotten to the hard work of writing the book. They've outlined chapters, they've talked to friends, or they've read other books, or they've done research, but until you sit down and start writing, you will not write a book.
Mm-hmm.
And if you wait for inspiration, God help you, because the muse of inspiration doesn't come around every day.
Right? That's so true. And writing the book is not fun every day, but you still do it because that's what gets you the book.
It's like exercise, and it's a lot more fun after you've done it.
Right.
You don't feel great going to the gym, but later you feel better because you did, and it's the same with having a book. It may have been hard work to write, but once it's done, you feel proud of the work that you invested.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so we talked about this gap. What are some things that we can do, say, a little more tactically within our workplace to kind of close that gap between intentions and planning?
Well, one of the questions that I ask very early in the book is, better at what? This isn't meant to be some kind of a better at everything I do every moment of every day. It's about getting better at what matters, and what I've created, the system I've created from observing others and the systems that I've used over the years can be used, obviously, in your professional life. It can be used in your personal life. It can be used in relationships. It can be used literally in any area if it's an important area to you. Don't get better in areas that aren't important. I think sometimes that's another trick we play on ourselves. We make sure our expense accounts are really, really neatly done, right? But they just need to be done accurately. You don't need to format them and do anything above do them accurately. But that kind of then replaces the time you could have spent on doing something more important, like following up on a sales call or prospecting. Mm-hmm. So one of the first things, and it's probably, at least in my work with audiences in corporate America, it's a very simple question, but it's one of the techniques in the book, and it says, who or what in your life needs disrupted? Change doesn't happen without disruption. And there are things right now that are antiquated that you keep doing them because they're habitual. There are relationships that either need to be positively disrupted. In other words, you need to let the person in that relationship know how much you appreciate them and what they're doing right, or they need to be disrupted for the sake of change. People say, well, I don't want to disrupt a low performer on my team. And I say, great, so in 2 years you just fire them. You think that'll be a disruption? I mean, you disrupt people so you don't have to fire them. You disrupt processes before they become antiquated. And my work with leaders, I say all leadership is disruptive. Management is about maintenance. Management says, here's what we're doing and here's how we're going to maintain it. But all leadership is about creating change. And when I say disruptive, it doesn't mean necessarily earth-shattering or revolutionary or painful, but it does change the equilibrium. The only way you change is when you disrupt the equilibrium, and then you go to you create new equilibrium in a different area.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I could see that absolutely. I mean, yeah, it's tough to kind of be willing to put yourself out there and to be willing to disrupt the equilibrium, as you mentioned.
But here's the point: if you don't, somebody else will. In other words, you either are the disruptor or the disruptee. There's no neutral ground. If you put off disrupting what needs to be disrupted, it will disrupt you. It will result in lost revenue or lost results or loss of relationship, any number of things. So it's, I hate the term lesser of two evils because nobody wants to choose between two evils, but it is certainly the better path to leadership and change than waiting. By the time, if you change only when you have to, you're just barely staying even. It's about the ability to change before you have to.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And to kind of see the path out there. Well, one thing that you write about, and I saw this and I thought, wow, that's quite an interesting idea. You mentioned that we should be bettering ourselves on a continuous basis rather than setting long-term agendas. And I think oftentimes setting a long-term agenda is very attractive because we know exactly where we're going. But help us to understand, why you encourage us to better ourselves continuously rather than sticking to the long-term agenda.
Well, I think a long-term agenda can be a good thing. I think, regrettably, the longer the term, the less likely it will be a realistic agenda. The world changes quickly. Customers' demands change. Our preferences change. Our employers' requests of us change. So it's not so much that I have anything against a long-term agenda, but what we should be doing, and it's a technique I call increased capacity. We should be learning skills that will allow us to be better at whatever challenges or changes we face. We should be developing, either improving or developing skills that will help us attain that long-term agenda. If you're in a marketing department and you're 55 years of age and you really didn't come up at a time when social media was as prevalent, maybe one of the things you ought to get better at is understanding the social media platforms and how each is different and how each is more effective in one area than the other. And that's one of those skills that will serve you well, not just in your current role in marketing, but if you should go to another department or another company or another industry, because that's become kind of a skill set that transcends individual departments or performance. So keep increasing your capacity so you have the ability to increase output without just working harder, which is how most people who don't increase capacity do it. They just work twice as hard to get the same results that somebody that's twice as skilled gets.
Ooh, that's such a good example that you mentioned about digital marketing and working within marketing. In my previous career, I was the head of digital marketing at 3 different organizations. And I remember at one of them, I was having a meeting with one of the C-level executives, and she said to me with a totally straight face, "What is this Wikipedia thing, and how do people even know about it?" And I remember just, feeling like a deer in headlights, like, how do I answer this without, being rude? Back to this person, like, well, I think everyone knows about Wikipedia. You just Google and it shows up. And, but I think, like in her case, just some level of knowledge about the space would have been really helpful. And I think when she would say things like that in meetings, it really made her look outdated. And,
it undermined her credibility. It'd be like somebody 50 years ago saying, "What's a dictionary?" or "What's an encyclopedia?" Right?
Like,
because it's just so it's such common knowledge in current culture.
Right. And it took away from, she had great experience, so it kind of overshadowed, like, her inability to understand this area that really influenced her business, overshadowed her other skills and her other expertise. So I completely agree. And it also probably put her in a situation where she had to depend on other people that she didn't really, she didn't know if they were really steering her the right way. But that makes a lot of sense, like keeping yourself continuously up to date. You also talk about something I find really interesting about top performers, and you talk about that top performers should go beyond just achieving their goals or making the numbers. Like, we should do more than just kind of hitting the numbers. And can you talk about why you think that's important?
Everybody, tends to talk about goals as if they're sacred, and I certainly believe in the power of goals, but there's a downside to goals people don't often consider, and that is, once you've achieved your goals, you let off the throttle. If your goal is to make a sale today and you make that sale by 11 in the morning, what do you do for the rest of the day? I call it the security of the achieved goal. It's not about achieving your goal. It's about achieving your goal and then surpassing it. Most clients I've worked with leave a lot of money on the table. I always say the easiest way not to be disappointed is don't expect much. Mm-hmm. The easiest way to achieve your goals is to set low goals. And when you do that, you limit your own performance. So, certainly if you work for an employer, they have goals and numbers to create accountability. But don't let that unconsciously limit you. If your goal for the year is X, why not go for, when you get to X, keep going and see if you can reach Y, or even Z. So I just tell people, don't let your goals inadvertently and unconsciously limit you, because the security to achieve goal says, wow, I made my sale, it's only 11 o'clock, I'm going to take a long lunch and kick off for a cocktail at 4, when you could have maybe doubled your production or tripled it by just continuing on.
Absolutely. And I think that in order to do that, you have to have some level of, you have to really care about your own performance and the kind of person that you want to be when you show up to work. I see a lot of people who sometimes just want to punch in and punch out, and they don't have that same passion and care about what they're doing each day. I think you really have to have that in order to want to go to why.
Yeah, lethargy, entropy, says, systems don't increase energy, energy decreases over time. So if you're not doing something to fuel the system, you're going to trend towards lethargy.
Absolutely. Well, so I want to give you an example that I've seen lately and maybe get your feedback on it. On a slightly different note, I've had a number of young people contact me, and they've got a question about their current job. And the scenario basically is they maybe are the smartest person in their department, and they've been working really hard, and they have more output than the other people on the team. At least that's how they feel. And they come to me and they say, Angela, I am ready to go and ask for a raise. And it's not time for my annual review, and I'm not really ready yet for a promotion, but I'm really good at my job, and I think that I should be paid more, a lot more. And I think one of the folks I spoke with, they were hoping to be paid like 50% more. Anyway,
optimistic.
Right. So I'm curious what your perspective on this. I have my own sort of feeling, but what would your perspective be on this kind of situation?
It kind of reminds me, a lot of years ago, I had an employee come to me and said that they wanted to make more money. And I said, great. I thought that was a wonderful door opener for me to talk to them about what they would do, to increase their value. And I said, well, what are you going to be able to do to enable me to pay you more money? And she said, why would I do anything more until you paid me more money? So she had it kind of backwards. If in this scenario, it seems like the individual is pretty convinced that their output is significant, they need to be able to quantify it. You can't go to your boss and say, I'm a lot better than everybody else, pay me more. But if you can demonstrate that the metrics show that you're producing more, when you go to work and you are, I will say your salary and your job description, your expectations are your baseline. If you fall below the baseline, you should never be rewarded to get back up to baseline. That's another thing I see, interestingly. People go, well, I'm underperforming, so I need to be motivated and be paid more. I've been here 3 years. No, you've got to meet your baseline before you even qualify for consideration. But if you're performing above your baseline, one of two things is going on. Either your boss is testing your abilities for a future promotion, or he or she's taken advantage of you. And in that case, I think that and again, this assumes that you have a rational boss. I know that sometimes is a leap, but if you have a rational boss, go to him or her and explain to them the situation. I wouldn't do it immediately, but I would simply say over the last 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, my production has gone from here to here. My responsibilities have increased in these areas, and I feel like that my what I was being paid before this happened isn't commensurate with what I have earned now. And I would use the word earned over deserve. Nobody deserves anything, but you do earn things. So I kind of, as you explain that scenario, I kind of see a boss who basically keeps, and this happens a lot, good employees get punished for being good because they get more and more to do, and bad employees get rewarded for being bad because nobody trusts them, so they don't give them anything to do. And that's a scenario that I would very much want to avoid if I was that peak performer.
I mean, I think if you're really truly the peak performer and you're not being recognized, at some point you may want to choose to look at a different company, for work for a different boss.
Oh, unequivocally.
Right.
And by the way, here's something you probably tell your clients, and that is if you say you're going to leave for more money and they say they'll match the money, that's the oldest trick in the book. The question you should ask is, why will you match it now that I'm leaving when you wouldn't pay it to me before? Because everybody thinks that they've pulled off a great coup by getting a better job offer and their employer matching it. Obviously, their employer wasn't willing to pay what that employee earned, or they wouldn't have had to go out and look for a better job offer.
I think that's a very good point. I think that's a very good point. I do think, though, in terms of this scenario, the other piece to it is oftentimes it's like how you mentioned with your example of having an employee approach you. It's, why should the company pay you more? It's like, why would your boss want to pay you more to do the same job that they hired you to do? Have your responsibilities grown? Are you ready for a promotion? Are you how are things changing? And I think you're right. You really have to be able to kind of quantify that.
Yeah, you've got to be able to demonstrate that you've earned that you should be paid what you the value you've created. So I think you and I are on the very same page.
Yeah, absolutely. I went to a conference very recently with LinkedIn.com, and one of the speakers there, they were analyzing millennials, and one of the speakers said that they found in their research that every approximately 2 years, the folks who are in the millennial generation, they expect a raise regardless of performance. And that's what they found in their research, was just that was the expectation. I think kind of our discussion today goes back to the idea that it's about more than just the 2 years. It's about what are you doing and how are you growing your value.
Exactly. You can't, a rational business can't survive by simply giving people more money for longevity. Mm-hmm. The whole, and here's the other interesting thing, Reid Hoffman and the guy that co-authored his book with him said that when a person joins LinkedIn, when they go to work, I should say, for a company, their question is, will working here make my LinkedIn profile better and make me more hireable in the future? Well, if you're to be more hireable in the future, you have to do something. If all your LinkedIn profile says, I sat on my ass for 2 years, mm-hmm. nobody's going to hire you. It's about using the time that you have, which really, Angela, goes right back to my book, using the time that you have to get better. And if you get better, you increase your capacity to produce more, then you are more marketable in the marketplace.
Totally. Well, so one thing I also noticed that you mentioned is that there's something in your mind that's a little more important than the ability to change. And what is that thing that's more important than our ability to change?
The ability to change faster than your competition.
Ooh.
Everybody changes. How I tell when I'm in front of a corporate audience, I say, they've asked me to talk about how to change today, but I already am convinced you know how. And the proof I have is that you're still sitting here. The people that couldn't change are no longer here. They're gone. They're elsewhere. So obviously, you have changed. The question is, are you changing fast enough to create a competitive advantage? Faster than the demands of your customer, or faster than your competition, or if you're in the government sector, faster than the crazy crap that regulators come up with. So I always tell people, the ability is overrated. Speed is what gives you the advantage.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's perfect. I really love it. Well, so where can we go to learn more about you, your book, The Potential Principle, and to learn more about your work and your speaking?
Sure. Well, just to learn about me and read my blogs, and I have about 70 videos posted, go to marksanborn.com, MarkSanborn.com, and specifically to learn more about the book, potentialprinciple.com. Not just potentialprinciple.com. And those two websites will give you everything and more that you might be interested in knowing.
Excellent. Well, I will put links to everything in the show notes so that it's easy to get to. Mark, thank you so much for joining me today. This has been great.
Well, the pleasure's been mine. Thank you, Angela.
Thank you. And thanks, everyone, for listening. Thanks to those of you who sent me questions. You can send me your questions to angela@copelandcoaching.com. You can also send me questions via Twitter. I'm @CopelandCoach. And on Facebook, I'm Copeland Coaching. Don't forget to help me out, subscribe on iTunes, and leave me a review.
Thank you for listening to the Copeland Coaching Podcast today with your host, Angela Copeland. Tune in next time to get more great tips on turning your job search into a slam dunk.